That is the pettiest point you could have ever possibly brought up.
Why is it petty, darling?
You know, once we have refocused on the feminism, everyone that arrived was just so much hotter.
All right. Hello, everyone. So, an Indian, a Ukrainian, and a Norwegian gathered together to record a podcast episode about a women-only music festival that happened for 40 years in fucking Michigan.
And you can't blame us for this, because
Mhm.
we are constantly talked to as if we should know what happened there, and more importantly, care.
Yep. So today we're here to talk about an interesting phenomenon in the history of lesbianism and feminism and lesbian feminism that happened in the United States, the center of the entire world. So of course, every single lesbian in the world must answer for the crimes of one Lisa Vogel, even if we do happen to be trans in any way ourselves. Okay, so we are obviously talking about Michfest, the Michigan's women's festival that started in 1975, ended in, I think, 2015 or 2014, I forget the exact year, and had a very explicit women-born women admission policy that destroyed the integrity of lesbian political discussions and forums for almost the entirety of its existence, and it's still kind of doing that now, actually. So, all right, I'm Talia, your evil lesbian feminist, who will obviously be coming out with a Michfest apology by the end of this episode. And today with me are my co-host and guest. Could you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Emma. For the longest time, I spelled Michfest with a T because I thought that the first half of it stood for Mitchell. That's
And
how much I
Which
know about
Mitchell?
Michfest. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
That's me.
and I'm Beth, and in all honesty, I thought Michfest was as much of a rumor as the battles.
Okay, that's amazing. We are clearly the most qualified people to be
Yes.
talking about and passing judgment on the United States lesbian feminist movement.
Like to me, it occupies the same rough sort of discursive space as DashCon.
Yeah, that's true. Also, I get accused of speaking over people all the time, and this is supposed to be my people technically.
White cis lesbians as well, which is clearly a community you have always been an uncomplicated part of, with no asterisks or caveats.
Yes, of course. So, in the interest of not speaking over trans people anymore, I shall endeavor to speak over a music festival from before I was born, I think. I don't.
Yeah, 1975. It started in 1975, went on for 40 years. That was before any of us was born.
Oh, yeah, that was before my parents were born, I think.
Yeah. We obviously, I know Beth mentioned DashCon. We do not have time to explain what DashCon is. Please go watch a Strange Eons video or something. But yeah, no, unfortunately, I do think that occupies the same discursive space as DashCon is hilariously. I mean, God, I hope that that's not what we remember Michfest's legacy as. We should really be talking about all of the incredibly complicated and bizarre trans politics and the discussions around it. It stopped existing 10 years ago, but people sort of act like it is this thing from the ancient past and sort of project their own ideas onto it, where it was oh, it was less exclusive, or it was more exclusive than you think. I think and I'm not joking, I've seen a person once say that Michfest, again, the Michigan Women's Music Festival, had quote unquote conversion camps for trans men. This is
What does that even mean?
not true. Well, okay, so we're gonna have to talk about the women-born women policy first and foremost. So, when she was 19, Lisa Vogel, a working class lesbian, there's this really awesome mythology around her. And I'm not gonna deny that it's not on some level an inspiring story, but Lisa Vogel had this idea to start a music festival on a plot of land where men would not be allowed for the entire period of time where it was ongoing. And, I'm not 100% sure if from the beginning Michigan Michfest was committed to showcasing lesbian art and lesbian artists specifically, but, obviously, given the nature of its clientele, that is sort of who ended up becoming the main focus. So she got together with a bunch of other dykes, built up Michfest from scratch, or so she says in this interview from her I have. Lisa Vogel was not a very public figure, especially when Michfest was embroiled in what she called the trans controversy. I don't have a lot of her words or story on hand, but yeah, and that's how Michfest came about. And it's pretty famous for being a kind of like really special place, at least to the women who attended it. Apparently, so it goes that like any woman who attends finds it difficult to not start crying at some point because being in a where you get to leave behind all of the psychic baggage and all of the like bad juju of like living in patriarchy and living under patriarchy was so special and meaningful. I can make a joke over here. I could say something like, "Well, my bedroom, of course," but
I was
um,
thinking that. I'm
yeah,
not
I
gonna
know. But
lie.
it's like okay, but like we're on a large scale. Like
Yeah.
we're all filthy little dyke separatists here. But like let's acknowledge for a second that there are very few like lesbian bars are disappearing the world over. Women only spaces are uh, fraught with controversy even when they are a thing. And I'll be real, they've never really been much of a thing. So
Mhm.
the idea of this like women's festival. Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to sound like a turf for a little bit. I have to set the scene, y'all. Imagine the idea of this like large scale venture. Where it's like only women as far as the eye can see, and there's like women running around naked, and you're woken up to the sounds of lesbian sex in the morning. It is kind of cool if you can afford the entrance fee, which I think I have a figure for the ticket price over here. Was it $350? I-
That is quite a bit. Also,
That
I don't think you sound
Hmm?
like a turf when you evangelize about waking up to sounds of lesbian
Yeah.
sex in the morning.
No, I sound like a fucking lesbian is what I sound like. But yeah.
You sound like yourself on a regular morning.
Yeah, the whole
Oh, thank
entrance
you.
fee to the vacation from patriarchy part really undermines some of the utopianness.
So let's start there because like I think that this is one of the things that like comes up in critiques of Mitch Fest, but it's kind of elided over,
Mm.
which is kind of funny because this is one of the rare cases where like the gender debate drowns out the class debate, right? The admission fee for Mitch Fest, yeah, there's a $350 figure in this like blog post I'm looking at from 2003. We'll explain what the blog post is in a little bit. Don't worry. But
Mm.
like in general, yeah, over the course of the years, Michfest has charged hundreds of dollars for admission, and obviously, women also have flown from all over the world. Apparently, definitely from all over the
Wow.
United States, but from all over the world in order to specifically to attend Michfest. So, for all of its like utopian idealism, it's not something that's very accessible, let's say. And a lot of this is because, well, it is something that was started by and for dykes, by and for working class dykes at that. And there is a certain understanding that, like, they do need to pay for this. And I believe for a while there, people were pretty sure that like Lisa Vogel was losing money on
Mm.
Mitchfest. Again, she is not a very vocal person herself. We're gonna be hearing a lot of things over the course of this episode about like, rumor has it or she said, but it's like,
Mm.
it can't have been like cheap to run Mitchfest, right? And so like, the steep price of admission sort of makes sense in a way. Like, I know if I was like not a particularly well off dyke, I think, from that period, from that area, and if I had a certain relationship to womanhood, I know that like even if I was struggling, saving to go to Mitchfest is probably something that I would have wanted to do at least once, right? But
Mm.
yeah, admission fee that was hundreds of dollars. It's a week long festival, but also here's the interesting thing: people were expected to not only pay hundreds of dollars in order to get in, but then they were also expected to do work, pick up some shifts, like
Okay.
transport people on the shuttle, pitch in with cleanup. So it's like well, you're giving your time, money, and your labor in order to enjoy this experience. And that's kind of interesting, isn't it?
It's giving like dodgy theater retreats. This is a highly
Ah,
specific example, but relevant to my life, I guess, because I've been to one.
I'm pretty sure our audience is like selected from the sort of people who can relate, but go on.
It just has this vibe of like an artsy,
Mhm.
spiritual, sort of vaguely lefty kind of thing that's like set up and it's like, ah, we don't have money. Ah, we don't know how to do anything. So let's charge exorbitant amounts that we're not
Mutual aid, communal
Uh-huh.
funding. Let's throw a bunch of buzzwords to highlight the fact that we're still
Mm-hmm.
charging people hundreds of dollars to come in and clean up trash as well while they're there. So all of that means that, like, no matter how well intentioned, this kind of like explicit admission policy, we're talking women born women only, hundreds of dollars, and once you're in, you better be willing to pick up your slack, honey. That does select towards a certain kind of audience, right? Disability justice and ableism were also topics that came up in critiques of Michfest. I think because the periods of peak discourse were like the 90s and the 2000s. And again, most of the other issues were drowned out by the gender debate, but that is something that people raised. When I get around to talking about camp trans later, well, I'll explain what camp trans is. But when I get around to talking about protests against Michfest later, there were attendees in wheelchairs who talked about that particular exclusionary aspect
Ugh.
of Michfest's policies. But besides that, there are some also additional interesting details about Michfest. Let's cycle back to the gender deferral for a second. So there was no explicit lesbians only policy. I think that indicates a certain degree of awareness that, like, no matter how many good intentions we have, it is not possible that like lesbians or queer women alone can really foot the bill here, right? So
Yeah.
that was never something that was checked for at the gate. I mean, you can't really check for women-born womanhood at the gate either, but like let's leave that aside. There were other interesting features of Fest, which is like, okay, so no men were obviously allowed to for the period of the festival, except for certain kinds of men. We'll get to that later, and except for the cleaning crews of dudes who would come in and like vacuum away all the sludge from the porta potties, which were called porta janes apparently. And every time the cleaning crew would arrive, a herald would announce them, yelling, "Man on the land! Man on the land!" There was a
What?
rule. Yep. There was a rule, by the way, that no man's voice, like men's voices, could not and should not be heard on the campgrounds of Michfest for the entirety of the duration. So you couldn't put on like Neil Diamond on your portable boombox or like listen to any music by men. Had to be all women, all the time, no male voices, no male energy, no male presence. People are gonna make fun of this, but if I'm being totally honest, with you, I don't like mind that.
Yeah, honestly, like I think that the transphobia is the problem, not the man exclusion. To be honest.
Yeah, controversial position, unironically controversial position, by the way. But hey, we're sticking to it.
Yeah, see, okay, there's the thing here, like, question of practical implementation of like, okay, you can set like a soft rule that
Mhm,
everything that is being like played, enjoyed, shown in this space should
mhm,
be by women, right? You
mhm,
can do that. But then like if you play a piece of song and like assuming you don't want to do a transphobia about it or whatever, right? If you play a piece of a
mhm.
song and like someone decides that the voice is too low and it sounds male, if you have to have debates to verify that, I think that's maybe bad and doesn't lead anywhere good. But I don't think that the
Yeah,
principle itself is bad.
yeah, and that's how things work in like smaller spaces of this kind, right?
Yeah.
Like I've been to a dyke bar and such, a very explicitly trans inclusive one. There's sort of the idea that like, hey, this is a sapphic space, it's literally in the name and everything, but like just kind of like it's fine. We're not gonna card you. We're not gonna like interrogate you when you step over that's be just be cool,
Mhm.
like the majority of the clientele, the majority of the people who will be there will, can safely be assumed to be sapphic women. But like, if you see someone who doesn't seem to fit into that category, I mean, as long as they're not being a nuisance, mind your business. Sort of a common sense approach, which
Yeah.
I will say that like Bitchfest was aiming to be a bit more militant than that. And this talk about like no male voices and this like restriction on the music that's being played in particular reminds me a little bit of Sandy Stone and Olivia Records, which we talked about in our transsexual empire. There was a lot of lesbian feminism that was being done in the music scene specifically. Maybe, that's a reason why there was this, particularly militant stance about like promoting women's voices, women's art, lesbian art, even. Still, though, the idea that like, okay, so a bunch of women who have paid hundreds of dollars to be on the campgrounds because they want to be in a male-only space. There are men on the festival sometimes. They're just the janitors cleaning up all the garbage. That is certainly an interesting picture. I mean, I'm not sure how you could have necessarily avoided that. Like if you're using a cleaning company because you have to rely on professionals after a point, then like the
Yeah.
lack of women in that workforce comes down to real world discriminatory hiring practices. I'm not sure exactly how you would negotiate that, but it is still very funny to imagine like the cleaning crew hired being announced by man on the land. Just
I mean, I'm gonna be. Don't kill me, okay? This is a
okay,
little bit
hit me.
classist. This is a little bit
Oh oh
classist.
oh oh. Okay, disclaimer. Right, hit me.
Yeah, so like okay, see, I really don't like when people like basically allude to misandry via classism or whatever.
Mhm,
And this isn't it. I'm not trying to
mhm,
do that. But like imagine being some guy who got hired to clean a festival, which is not a particularly enviable job. Cleaning in general, not the best of jobs, even if you like cleaning, right? On a commercial scale.
mhm,
And then
mhm,
instead of just being allowed to do your goddamn job, you are
mhm,
announced with loud and obnoxious yelling, just
mhm.
regardless of gender. That's so fucking annoying and demeaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you need to keep up like the lesbian feminist militancy around the people you are literally paying to clean up your shit. Is there not like maybe was there not like a hint of self-awareness there? I will say, by the way, based on like at least two different sources that like would have been mostly white women doing that too, and like based on the demographics of who ends up in menial jobs in the United States. I don't know. There are some
Hmm.
uncomfortable implications there.
Yeah, to say the
So
least.
that is to say the least. So yeah, that is my most sort of charitable attempt to like present the idea of Michfest, its history and its inspiration and its goings on in the most sort of like fair way I can. Like I know I have been accused frequently of romanticizing the lesbian community and whatnot, but I do have to be honest. I only have so much romanticism to muster for this. Like, like is the idea of like a super inclusive, large scale, like a whole area of land where you can roam free and naked and be amongst your fellow females. Is that fucking appealing? Of course it is. I'm a lesbian. Why wouldn't it be? But like uh, then you come down to the gritty reality of it, the way it was implemented. How the nitty gritty, the literal nitty gritty, dirty details of who was hoovering up the shit and why and how, and it's a lot less like poetic and starry eyed with those details. And I haven't even gotten to the fucking transphobia yet. So before I do get into it, and before I start talking about the main source for this episode, the main text that we will be discussing, what do you two, as a Ukrainian and Norwegian woman, know about the woman born woman policy of Michfest and the controversies surrounding it and the exclusion of trans people?
I mean, there's a couple of very obvious issues that I can see arising from a bunch of cis people trying to have a women-born women policy. I strongly suspect they wouldn't be particularly nice to trans women, for one. And then what happens when someone who's had a long history at Michfest starts taking testosterone?
Also an interesting question, isn't it? Because we're talking a lot about like female energy and male energy, men's voices, men's presence, masculinity. And this does point to a certain history of exclusion of trans women, obviously, about our like original sin of being born into manhood that we can never atone for sufficiently. But yeah, it does beg the question, what about trans men? It's very funny,
Yeah.
flashing back in the future, in this interview with After Ellen that Lisa Vogel gave in 2018, there
Hmm.
is an interesting bit where she says, no one ever talks about the FTMs, which is very funny because people were talking about the FTMs and about how they were allowed onto Michfest.
Yeah, I was also about to say that women born women can only be a transphobic policy because
Obviously, yeah.
there is no other excuse for it. Because if you just want to be surrounded by women and only women, you don't need to specify. Um,
Mhm.
It's kind of like we were talking the other day for unrelated reasons about names. Someone silly was trying to say that there are cultures in which everyone uses their birth names. It's just a cultural staple, and saying that people change their names or have nicknames is imposing American culture, which is the most absurd thing I've ever heard. And I basically said, well, if I tell you my name is this, how do you know I'm not using my birth name? Or how do you know that I do? Like, this is pretty random. In the same vein, what does being born a woman mean? And how do you even know? If I tell you I am a woman, how do you know I was born one or not?
There are a couple of high-profile incidents, one high-profile incident in particular, where the trans activists who ended up protesting Michfest, spoilers, I guess, stress tested that theory, and it'll be interesting to talk about what happened as a result of that. But yeah, that's a very good point. Because if you're saying that women born women are allowed, if you're saying trans men are allowed on Michfest, how do you check? How do you regulate? For that matter, much later, there's a little excerpt from a different author, who that I will be going over, two short excerpts from her book that is a memoir about her life, where she talks a little bit about Michfest, and one of the excerpts deals with a lesbian femme who had saved up for this vacation with her butch, but she was very nervous because she was going the year after a transsexual woman had been expelled from Michfest's ground, and she was very nervous for her butch because her butch did not look like someone who would necessarily meet the woman-born woman criteria, and she was hoping that just like being in the proximity of her fen would be enough to get past the gates, as it were. By the way, we're all talking about this in very dramatic terms, gates, expulsion, check. It should be noted, just for the sake of sanity and clarity, this is really informal. Obviously, there were a couple of high-profile incidents where people who wanted to start trouble for bigoted reasons did start trouble, did cause problems for trans people, but for the most part, the people selling tickets were volunteers, unpaid at that. Probably who had paid hundreds of dollars to be unpaid volunteers. They probably weren't too fussed. They probably weren't not like giving you chromosome tests and like putting you through a like biological sex scanner on the way into Michfest.
I assume it was just like general ambient hostility.
Or like, if they could even tell, because like let's point out how that's like very important. Like, first of all, like, there were trans mass and trans men and like obviously very masculine butches who attended Michfest. And like, were they side-eyed? Maybe, probably, but like, there's always this like very interesting conversation about like lesbian communities and and their tolerance for like butch masculinity. A lot of us love butches, but also like have opinions on like are butches real women? Are you abandoning womanhood? Are you part of the sisterhood anymore? But like to a certain degree, butches are a common sight in lesbian communities. Obviously, it is probably just a true thing that like a lot of trans people, probably both men and women, stayed away from Michfest due to its reputation. But there's probably like a decent amount of like it ran for 40 years. There were probably trans men and even trans women who attended Michfest, like maybe even multiple times. Like it's just one of those things that like probably happened, and we didn't care about every case of it happening because no one kicked up a fuss. So we're gonna start by discussing the big incident in 1991, the expulsion of transsexual woman Nancy Jean Burkholder. The text that I'm referring to is a very large piece by Michelle T. It's been published online on McSweeney's in 2013, but it was written in 2003. And it's a very long piece. It goes over a lot of things. Michfest's history, savory and not, is the large scale incidents of like confrontations between fest attendees and protesters who, after Nancy Jean Burkholder's expulsion in 1991, formed a counter camp in protest of sorts every year following 1991 called Camp Trans.
I have heard of that actually.
Yeah. Julia Serrano, I believe, has actually talked about it on. I don't remember if she talked about it in Whipping Girl or only in her blog posts. I've read a lot of Serrano stuff. I'm not 100% sure if I could tell you exactly where I read what, but yeah. And yeah, so Camp Trans was the year after Nancy Jean Burkholder was excluded. Regarding Nancy Jean Burkholder, how do y'all imagine she was expelled? And like how that entire thing went down? Because there's been a lot of rumors and hearsay, but like what do y'all think actually happened? Or like have you heard about how that went down?
I haven't heard a damn thing.
I mean, I certainly don't expect that she like pinged the masculine energy detector and was ousted upon her spirit penis being discovered or something.
Yeah, I doubt
I
it.
think what happened is she went into one of those microwave American TSA
Ah,
things, and she stood in there, and then her outline was blue, and they were like, "No," and that's what happened.
No,
Don't check.
most likely she was there. Someone who knew she was trans was there, and started making trouble because of that.
Yeah.
yeah, so it is kind of funny though, right? Because we hear so much about this, like, this is the major inciting incident. This is the thing that like resulted in Camp Trans even being formed. But like I bet like neither of you all had even heard Nancy Jean Burkholder's name that much. I want to respond to something that you specifically said, Beth, about how like you doubt that like her spiritual phallic energy had been pinged or whatever. And it's like, yeah, no, it's actually very funny because in this article that Nancy Jean Burkholder herself wrote, to a gay Boston newspaper in the aftermath of being expelled, she talks about how 1991 was not her first festival. It was not her first year at the festival. Because
Makes
her
sense.
first festival was 1990, where she met so many women, hundreds of women, she says, working shifts at the sober support tent, going to concerts, standing in food lanes at the kitchen, and everyone she spoke to was very pleasant to her, and everyone she, met did not seem to have a problem with her in 1990. So,
Was she closeted
as I
about
said,
her transness the whole time?
yeah, so that's the awkward thing, right? What does closeted about transness in a lesbian space mean? Like, I am someone who doesn't really make a secret about the fact that I'm a tranny. I use the word. I talk about transitioning very open and loud about it, almost in a, not quite in a I dare anyone to challenge me sort of way, but in a sort of like, look, this is a part of my life, and like, if you have a problem with it, I would rather you sat 2 seats further away from me, right?
Yeah, but
But like,
there is also an element of like in real life
mm,
often, because it's like online is a bit of a different story, right?
yeah.
Because
Mhm,
you have a profile, you have a declarative identity that comes before anything happens. In real life, the only thing you have
mhm,
is literally your appearance and like your voice and whatnot. So being trans, if you like pass reasonably well as cis, basically, you need to
mhm,
often either it comes up in conversation for some reason organically in some
mhm.
way, or you would have to go out of your way to mention it. So it's like after a certain point in transition, it's actually quite easy to be closeted as trans by
Yeah.
default because you would need to voice it proactively.
And it can get really awkward because there the actual sort of like point where it makes sense to introduce that you're trans, directing
Mhm.
the conversation in that direction with cis people who don't expect it is so awkward because
Yeah.
transness doesn't really come up if you're just like talking casually with people who don't have transness on their minds.
That's true. I mean, like, it can come up in the sense of like when people start talking about like I don't know childhood anecdotes or like university anecdotes, like
Mhm.
a time before you transitioned, and then you either have to like do a little bit of eliding and white lying if you want to share an anecdote, or you can just go for it. But then it's also like you mentioning that you're trans would often derail the conversation because it's probably not about that and other stuff like that. So yeah, it can be quite awkward.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and also like my day-to-day life, there's not that many periods or like, occasions where it's really relevant. Like I do not walk into every
Oh yeah,
room
absolutely.
asking my butch to like announce my arrival. Like a tranny is about to walk in. Like, like I move through life as a woman. This sometimes includes queer spaces as well. Remember what I said earlier? Like people were probably going to Michfest without much issue. So like, okay,
Yeah.
Michelle T's Transmissions from Camp Trans. It has a first person section where by Nancy Jean Burkholder, I'm pretty sure. Or like it at least has a section that is subtitled Nancy Jean Burkholder, and then the rest of it is in first person. And she talks pretty casually, being like, yeah, no, I did my research. I looked at the materials. Like, yeah, it said woman born women, but like everyone I talked to was like, oh, you'll be fine. Like I didn't have any real reason to believe that I wouldn't be unwelcome there. And then like,
I mean, that kind of makes sense to be honest, because like, well, like obviously in Ukraine we don't really have like, well, we do have turfs, but they're like no one cares. You will never encounter an actual big, so like a music festival or something like that has like explicitly transphobic policies. It's just that in general
mhm.
people don't really like grok trans people existing. Like they know, but they don't really know. You know what I mean? So like there are a lot of
Yeah,
places that
pretty
are not
much.
explicitly exclusionary, but like technically you can expect people to be transphobic there, and it's basically like well, if you pass well enough, it's fine.
Yeah, and it sort of makes navigating the world awkward, right? Because like,
Mhm.
most people aren't like virulent, dedicated zealous frothing transos, but like most people have like a certain amount of like transphobia, a certain amount of sexism, a
Yep.
certain amount of bias, and like who will be weird if they find out that you are trans. And like, but like as Nancy herself wrote in her bloody article, well, she was there in 1990 and no one kicked up a fuss. So like in 1991, she went back with her friend Laura, right? They got there super early. They picked up some work shifts. They were driving people. They took shuttle duty. They were driving people back and forth, or like to the site. They were just kind of like having a pretty normal festival experience. And then while Lord Laura was away, doing her work shifts, Nancy, in her own words, she was just kind of chilling by a campfire, and she was approached by a couple of women, she says, who asked her point blank, "Are you transsexual?" So this smells kind of fishy to me, right? I'm not 100% sure what happened there, what motivated them to ask that. Like, Nancy's response was to just be like, "Look, my history is none of your business. Why are you asking me this?" And they kept asking her. She kept repeating that. And at one point, she actually even offered to drop her drawers. So, from which I'm assuming that Nancy Jean Burkholder is post-op. So, in terms of whether her spiritual penis energy was spotted, pretty sure it wasn't. And it just kept escalating and getting more hostile. And after a point, it was very evident to Nancy that she would not be able to placate these folks. Like, the women first told her that, like, she's not welcome there. She asked them, like, well, there's no explicit rule saying I can't be here, you know? So then the women went to the festival organizers, or so they say, and then came back with festival security guards and were like, well, no, yeah, transsexuals can't be here. And she was pretty much unceremoniously ejected. She and Laura left. They had arranged for a shitty little hotel room for them, which was, I guess, somewhat nice, I guess. But yeah, she flew back to New England. Laura stayed behind to, like, tell, like, Nancy's other friends what had happened to her, because otherwise it would have been just like she, like, up and vanished into smoke, right? And then Laura and Janice, one of Nancy's other friends, just stayed behind talking to the other festival attendees about what happened. And this is the sort of seed of Camp Trans, right? So it should be noted, even when, like, Nancy Jean Burkholder was ejected by a bunch of belligerents from Michfest, she did have friends there, people who she had presumably met in 1990, or other people she was hoping to meet at the festival. And there were people who stuck up for her. There were people who were like, this is kind of bullshit, actually. So even on the hallowed woman-born woman land and all that, this has never been like as uncontroversial as people like Lisa Vogel would like to pretend that it is,
I mean, that does make sense, especially if this was like a pretty big event. It's just like, it's not your little clique, it's not your Discord chat. People are going to come that are just sort of interested in women's art and music. So, and most of them are usually normal.
Exactly.
I do wonder. I do wonder one thing.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. Transphobic policies aside, like, logically, it would be easier for a trans woman post-transition to enter the space than for a trans man. I am genuinely curious. I don't know if you have this information, but like, how did trans men that wanted to attend this space navigate it? Was it just like a case that like they didn't actually, at least after a while, care about men that much and they just let them through? Or like, did they have to prove something? Like, I don't know what's going on. Did they have to have been pre-transition there also? Like,
so I don't have any accounts from people who weren't Camp Trans attendees, but there is a case that I'll get to later on of a trans man who had phalloplasty, so a full-on penis man, just walking up to like the ticket sellers and being like, hey, so my trans women friends aren't allowed here because they're not women-born women, but I am transitioned and I've had a phalloplasty and I've got a penis, but I'm a woman-born woman according to y'all, right? So can I get a ticket? And he was let in. And then he went and took a shower. Like a public communal shower, got naked around other people. And obviously, not everyone psychically knows that he is a trans man, so people freaked out about it. And then the rumor started that no less than 6 trans women had stormed Michfest and waved their erect penises around.
Isn't that just so typical?
Yeah. And it's just like, I'm not going to like fault the guy too much, I guess. I don't know.
This is like the archetypal, like, there was some bathroom ban bullshit, and then someone's like, do you want this man in the women's bathroom? And it annoys me so fucking much.
It's a little bit like the whole uterus havers thing. Like for there was a period of time where like trans and queer activists were saying that like there are a lot of trans individuals, trans masculine individuals or genderqueer individuals who can get pregnant and who aren't comfortable with the equivocation of how gendered, maternity care is, even the fact that it's called maternity care, So, rather than, calling, saying pregnant women or things like that, we should say pregnant people or uterus havers. And the gender criticals who lost their shit about that blamed trans women exclusively, when this is not an issue that directly affects trans women.
Yep.
Yeah, for as much as it sucks, trans women straight up just aren't uterus havers and do not need to concern themselves too much about being lumped in with the wrong type of uterus haver in stuff for uterus havers.
Which is an interesting consequence of trans mask invisibilization, right? So when people think of trans issues or a lot of the global trans panic is specifically around trans misogynistic tropes, bathrooms, prisons, sports, These men are invading women-only spaces and all that. So an interesting conversation of trans mask and invisibilization is that even when trans men and trans masks try to talk about trans men's issues, it can very easily get warped into trans misogyny. And I'm not 100% sure what the best way to prevent that from happening is, but it is a thing that happens. And it happened with someone who was trying to make a point about the women board women policy, admission policy of Michfest. I quite frankly, I'd be interested to know if he had consulted with anyone before doing that. It's one thing to be I have a penis, but I'm woman born woman. Would you sell me a ticket? And it's another thing to just go to a communal space and disrobe and then flash your dick around. Could he not have maybe foreseen how that would have gone?
It's a pretty great illustration of how when you try to logic trap your way out of transphobia as a trans man, it's very important to make sure that your logic trap is actually working and not just displacing the consequences onto trans women.
Yeah, because we're going to talk about we're going to talk about the complex place of trans men and trans masks in this entire discourse a little bit later on. But and suffice it to say, there is a certain degree of I have to assume that most trans men just were not interested in going to Michigan Women's Festival. Let's just get that out of the way. There probably were trans men who grew up in lesbian communities, had a lot of affinity there, and they were probably grateful that they were welcomed there. But there's for the most part, it does say women-born women can enter, but I don't imagine there's a lot of trans men who are comfortable being referred to as such. So I'm actually gonna go to a completely different section in Michelle's T's article to talk about the another trans man who attended Camp Trans, Summit 2003. So we only know him as Chris, and here's Chris's very funny story of how he got involved in Camp Trans. Chris talked to Michelle about how he was confused about Camp Trans because he thought it was a bunch of trans men trying to get into the women's festival. And he said he wasn't down with that. He was very put off by it. His stance on Camp Trans was, listen, guys, if you transition, you gain a few privileges, you lose a few. You're guys now. You can't enter the women's festival. It's and this is just the most himbo energy ever. This is just a positive guy, He's interpreting everything in the best faith possible. He's just oh what? Wait, the Michigan Women's Festival is complaining about these trans men trying to get into the festival. He assumes that they mean trans men and that they aren't implicitly misgendering anyone. He's just no, listen, I'm not down. I don't think trans guys should get to go to Michfest anymore. That's Chris's take. And then he found out what he was actually about, and he was oh, holy shit, I should get involved.
I'm sorry, that's so funny.
Chris is hilarious. Chris is oddly wholesome. We don't hear he's mentioned a few times in this piece, but he's just one of the attendees of the 2003 Camp Trans, and the piece isn't really focused on any one individual. But I just found this incredibly amusing, and it does show a kind of subtle. So this is not very talked about very much, but there is a subtle well, I don't know how subtle it is because I do not spend a lot of time in trans men's communities, but there are trans men, and I know a fair few of them. They're gay. Who are very frustrated with the association of trans manhood with lesbianism. All the people are butch lesbians and trans men are innately coupled, and I know trans men and butch lesbians who are very annoyed by that.
Yeah, look, the thing is, when you want to transition to male, one assumes that you want to do it. It's people want the butch flight to happen, is what I'm saying. It's like people want it to be true when they act this way. It's like, masculine women, men, what's the difference really? Who cares? It's like, okay, this seems a bit backwards to me.
Yeah, and it's not like it's not quite that simple. There are some prominent voices who basically are like, trans men are basically, or like, butch lesbians are just like trans men who have learned to live with their dysphoria. Jack Halberstam, shut the fuck up. But I'm not entirely sure how much of like an absolute majority of trans men that opinion. I don't think it's a lot, to be totally frank.
No, I wouldn't say that it is.
So yeah, all of which to say, I'm sure there were trans guys who were like who wanted to attend Michigan Women's Festival and did so despite the fact that it was a very explicitly trans misogynistic policy. And those guys are, kind of assholes. And they probably exist, but like, they're sort of part of the complicated history of the complicated conversation around women's only spaces, who gets to be in lesbian spaces, and what the stakes of this are, and like who ultimately ends up getting villainized the most, and how for trying to change that.
Yeah.
So that's the story of Nancy Jean Burkholder's expulsion in particular. A friend of hers, Janice, actually went back in 1982 with Janice's sister, who was also a post-op trans woman, an intersex individual, and a butch lesbian. And they handed out pamphlets, presumably to like start raising awareness of like, hey, listen, let's all think and talk about gender.
Okay.
And to a certain degree, I don't want to be like seen as making excuses for like a lesbian politics that at the time was very explicitly trans misogynistic. But there were also probably a lot of like people in attendance at Michfest who just hadn't like never heard of these controversies and had like, didn't really know much about trans issues, period. Of course, that was more true in 1991 and 1992, but as like, camp trans became a thing and like people started talking about this, and specifically the incident, the exclusion of Nancy Jean Burkholder, Michfest acquired a certain reputation. And the question of like how morally culpable you were in the policy and such, if you continued to attend and support Michfest with your money and time and labor, that became a huge deal as the 90s and the 2000s went on, which brings us a bit closer to, well, it brings us to 2003. It brings us to the actual year of Michelle T's piece, Transmissions from Camp Trans, where Michelle T is not a trans woman. She is a queer woman. At one point during this piece, she has tears in her eyes because she listens to some spoken word by a trans woman where she chastises cis lesbians for, being very accepting of trans men, dating trans men, but every single time they talk about their boyfriend, they caveat it with, he's trans. No, don't worry. I'm not dating a real man. And Michelle T apparently was moved to tears by this speech because she herself was guilty of that. She has a trans boyfriend, and every single time she talks about her trans boyfriend, she rushes to add, he's trans. Don't mistake me for one of you basic heterosexuals. Which is another interesting thing to me, right? Because, like, imagine a world in which, like, outing yourself is something you feel compelled to do because your visibility is more important to you than your safety.
Or even just being able to hang out around people like a normal person without disclosing your chromosomal setup.
So, I really appreciate this article by Michelle T. And, it has a lot of historical value. I really am excited to share a lot of the stories of the 2003 Camp Trans attendee that, like, Michelle T. documented over here. I will say, she expresses a few opinions in here that make me go, thus. I'll just say that much. So, this is something that, like, both of you have probably heard me talk about in the past. What do you think what do you think happened to Camp Trans between 1992 and 2003? I have spoken about it in the past, but it's like it's okay if you miss. Yeah. So like Camp Trans. Okay, so it was initially set up as a protest explicitly. It was set up at the mouth of the festival in its early years. But after the first couple of years, it kind of faded away for whatever reason. And then in about 1999, I believe, this article says, some trans folks tried to bring back Camp Trans, but it came back in a very interesting way, as a very particular interesting iteration. For one particular thing, it was no longer set up directly in front of Michfest. It was tucked out of sight, according to Michelle T, like just up the road. But another thing was that like so festival attendees, sort of a lot of whom were aware of Camp Trans, didn't realize that Camp Trans was a protest at all. And why do you think that happened?
Because now it was for the less boys.
It would be funny. My bet is more likely that they removed all messaging from their advertising that could indicate that it was a protest and just kind of acted like it was a different festival for all practical intents and purposes.
I believe that was part of it. The article does at one point say that, yeah, in fact, there were a lot of festival attendees who saw Camp Trans as a kind of suburb to go to, specifically to cruise and hook up with hot, and this is the word the article uses, tranny boys. So this is where we have to address the other awkward part of things. It faded away a little bit in the middle of the 1990s after like Nancy Burkholder's initial sort of like push. Nancy Burkholder and her friends' initial push to raise awareness about how unfair the exclusionary policy towards trans women is. And when it came back in 1999, it was brought back by a trans mask activist. It had a lot of the, let's say, the specificity taken out of it regarding the exclusion of trans women specifically. And, so it became a more of a, I have to mention, it became more of a general purpose, trans inclusion sort of thing. And so what ended up happening was that the cis lesbians who didn't really view trans men as men, or like were not really willing to confront what attraction to trans men meant for their sexuality, sort of treated Camp Trans as a cruising zone to go and hook up with trans guys, hot tranny boys, as the article calls them. And so it just kind of became a little attraction for fetishists.
See, listen, they say that trans women's, at least trans lesbians, like subculture is hypersexual, and this is not unearned per se. But can I say something?
Yes.
Trans men's subcultures are also pretty hypersexual. I think it's just a feature of trans people transitioning and finally liking sex for the first time in their lives. But can you be less pathetic, please, specifically to trans men?
I'm gonna let you say that. I know you're a detrans lesbian, but like you just spent 10 years as a trans man,
I did, yeah.
Actually, you know what? No, fuck it, I'll say it with my own mouth. This is incredibly funny. I remember this like historical thing that happened, right? So like this is why this is why Michelle T is like writing this 2003 article about Michfest at all, because a trans woman named Sadie Crabtree sort of like took hold of the reins and like tried to like refocus, try to bring back the focus of Camp Trans to being a protest specifically centered on the exclusionary policy and the exclusion of trans women. Because here's the thing. If you just say that, like, oh, it's just transphobia, or if you remove the specificity when dealing with explicitly trans misogynistic politics, you get shit like this. You get shit like, oh, yeah, the trans guys will bring back Camp Trans after it fades away, and they'll turn it into a fucking hookup spot for those trans misogynistic cis lesbians. The word betrayal is too soft. I'll be real right now. The word betrayal is too soft. That is like fucking pathetic ass worm behavior. What the fuck do you mean that you commandeered a fucking protest about the exclusion of trans women and turned it into, hey, let's, cis lesbians who are trans misogynistic and don't really see me as a guy, come fuck me. Stand up! Get a spine! Oh yeah, and stop being dicks to trans women too while you're at it. Fuck. That goes at the end because I know it's the least important part to guys like this. But yeah.
It's like, please be pathetic in a way that doesn't do splash damage to other people. I'm not even asking to not be pathetic, just be pathetic in a way where it's your problem.
Mm-hmm.
That would be nice, but that never happens with men.
Well, anyway, so after the men fucked all that up, a woman came in and had to clean up their mess. And that woman is Sadie Crabtree. So we're now finally talking about 2003 Camp Trans, about the direct topic of this article. And we're going to talk about exactly, what happened at this festival for a little bit. There's a couple of like small scale stories. Michelle is sort of like embedded with Camp Trans. She's a trans in any way herself, I don't think. She's a cis queer woman, and she's just sort of like reporting on everything and talking about all of the things that moved her. She's bisexual herself, and there is one point during the article where she talks about how everyone was so gender ambiguous and gender free and smashing the binary and dancing and hooking up. And I was like, also that's the thing. Like, it's a queer event, it's a queer space, it's a queer festival. People are gonna hook up. That's fine. It's just like, could you please not hook up explicitly with transphobes? Would that really kill you? But anyway, and Michelle T just talks about like how the 2003 Smash the Binary Camp Trans that was like refocusing on like the central issue of trans women's exclusion, how everyone there was just really fucking hot.
That is the pettiest point you could have ever possibly brought up, but I like
Why
it.
is it petty? Why is it petty, darling?
You know, once we have refocused on the feminism, everyone that arrived was just so much hotter. I mean, listen, last episode we were specifically talking about hooking up for your political ideas. And like, look, I made fun of that for good reason, but also people having bad politics does make them less hot, I'm sorry.
It's true.
It does. I'm sorry. I will say it's sort of interesting about how even in like a protest that like aimed to focus on trans women, a lot of the like politics that like Michelle T is transcribing here and talking about is like it's very ungendered, right? It's post-gender, it's beyond gender, it's smashing the binary. And like Julia Serrano is there, but this is 2003 Julia Serrano, and I like presume she hasn't quite gotten around to writing Women Girl yet. So the word transmisogyny is not a word that really comes up in this article at all. And it is, you know, I do think that like the Ding 3 camp trans, the way Michelle T describes it, it does sound like a fun time. And, you know, I'm glad that like, you know, someone came in and was like, stop fucking transphobes. But also like, in terms of like, was it really any much more focused on the plight of the trans woman, of her exclusion from womanhood and lesbianism? I'm not so sure.
No, because any moment that something has been established to address trans women's grievances, the immediate next step is we have to talk about how, oh, but this is for everyone. It's not just for trans women. Everyone's valid. Everyone's concerns are important. Also, what even is a trans woman? I mean, are trans women even real?
There's so much trans advocacy that just boils down to gender neutrality, stop seeing gender, and it's just like, well, that's cool for you. And like for the few spaces we set, if we can set up truly gender neutral spaces, amazing, brava, good for us. But then I still have to go back out into the world and be gendered as a woman, and that has actual consequences and specific violences and like, you know, repercussions for me. Like, yes, it would be very cool if if the entire world stopped seeing gender. That's not going to happen. So what can we do to get to that point? Is the part that everyone lovingly skips over. It's like, okay, we like, I don't want you to fight for gender neutral spaces. I want you to try and fight for trans women's womanhood, for our oppression as women, for our recognition as women, because that is important at the current moment, because we're not going to wake up in a gender neutral world tomorrow.
How dare you get your feminism over my perfectly gender neutral post bigotry utopia? You're basically woman Hitler.
Yeah, right. I'm such a horrible reactionary because I have the revolutionary idea that maybe women should be centered in feminism. Shoot me right now.
I don't know how people don't hear the I don't see race in these. Like every time it's like,
yeah,
nothing should be about trans women because the moment something's about trans women, it's like, oh, but all people though. And
because
like,
this
okay.
is a very white movement, and they don't see the issue with not seeing race.
But they talk about how bad it is that it's white all the time. What do you mean they haven't solved it yet?
That's very funny of you to say, because Michelle T notes at the end that like the camp trans attendees were a bit distressed by the fact that they were mostly white, like the Michfest attendees, and they were like, oh, we don't want to go out and like, yep.
That's such
so
a
the difference
funny
between
sentence, I'm so sorry.
The Michfest attendees and the camp trans attendees. Well, no, I added like the Michfest attendees. Like, I don't want to give everyone the wrong idea or like make you think that like, oh, Michfest was super racially diverse. As I said, I'll be concluding with 2 excerpts from an author I respect very much, and we'll talk about that a little bit then. But yeah, the camp trans. The difference between Michfest and camp trans in this case was just that like Michfest attendees probably didn't fret over the fact that Michfest was very white. The camp trans attendees did, but how does
what?
So
are you not nourished by the distress of white people? Just empty distress, actionless.
Not particularly, no.
Just take a moment to flagellate ourselves for the sin of our whiteness. This is going to do absolutely nothing. And if we just feel guilty about it enough, we basically, I mean, clearly feeling guilty about something is basically morally equivalent to just solving the problem and addressing the issue.
Yeah, because like guilt is the most important thing here, right? It's like it purges you of sin, basically.
Yeah. And that's the actual problem with white guilt. Not that like white people like recognize that a thing is bad, but then like you recognize the thing is bad, and like, you know, it's not, the conditions and circumstances aren't perfect right now. But like what concrete steps do you have in mind to fix that? Well, anyway, so I'm gonna spotlight a couple of the stories, because in addition to just like sort of documenting the events of the 2003 Camp Trans, Michelle T also talked to a couple of the attendees, spotlighted their background, their stories, and I just want to like talk about at least a couple of them. So there was a mountain, um, who is a lesbian from an
I'm sorry, wait,
actual
hold on.
straight
Did
up
I
like
mishear you? Sorry, did I mishear you? You said there was a mountain who was a lesbian? What?
no. So there was a lesbian named Mountain.
Okay,
Sorry,
okay,
maybe I
okay.
should
Hell
just
yeah.
okay, okay.
Hell
Sorry, there
yeah.
was a
I'll
mountain
take
who
that
was
one.
a lesbian. I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh, of course.
Sorry. I'll take that again. I'll take that again.
She had like toxic
So,
fury with the local valley.
oh, shut the fuck up. Anyway, I'm taking it again. So there was Mountain, who was a lesbian and who was actually part of like a full-on like lesbian separatist farming commune and everything. The twist, the commune is completely transfem inclusive. There were a couple of like poetry slams and like open mic nights and stuff at Camp Trends, and like one of the things she said was that like I don't know, it's the bare minimum, but I found myself oddly moved. So like Mountain goes up to the mic and she says like I used to say that if I didn't go to Michfest every year I would die. Well, I'm not there now and I'm not dead. And look, if my little farming commune, you know, if I can figure out how to, have a female only space while including trans women, then Michfest has no fucking excuse. I will say the logic there doesn't really follow. Michfest is much larger and that makes the logistics
Yeah.
harder, not easier. But I love the sentiment. That's very cool. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's just another one of those things, right? I'll say the words epistemic injustice and epistemicide and all that. Trans lesbians do not have a lot of our history available to us. I'll just say that much. But it is just nice to know. It is nice to be reminded that there have been people like us just moving in and out of dyke communities with like varying levels of acceptance. We were not always every time public enemy number one to every single dyke, and I do draw a little bit of comfort from that. Sue me. Then
Can't
yes, yeah,
pursue legal action too busy short circuiting over mountain. I mean, goddamn. I love women.
then Julia Strada was also there. I think she was at multiple camp transes, I believe. But Michelle T writes about Julia Serrano being at the 2003 one and doing a little bit of spoken word poetry that I honestly quite enjoyed. And I'll read out one of them here. She recites the poem Cocky. And if I seem a bit cocky, well, that's because I refuse to make apologies for my body anymore. I am through being the human sacrifice offered up to appease other people's gender issues. Some women have a penis, some men don't. And the rest of the world is just going to have to get the fuck over it.
Nice.
Yeah. Relatively basic in 2025, but saying that Camp Trans in 2003, pretty cool, I think. Juliet Laurent does also have a first person section over here. She talks a little bit about Camp Trans, about her politics. She makes a comparison to racism, which I'm not going to repeat. Sorry, just please stop comparing trans issues to race unless you know what you're doing. But she just talk about one of the things that was true even in 2003, as true as it was in 1981, was that a lot of the festival goers just had a lot of very fixed ideas or misconceptions about trans people and what they were like. There was this specter among the Michfest attendees about trans women want to walk in here and wave their big giant hard penises around everyone. They just want women to look at their giant dongs. Saram talks about, a lot of trans women are pretty uncomfortable with their penises, right? This kind of It was funny as well because, in 1992, the first sort of unofficial Camp Trans, when Nancy Jean Burkholder's friends went back to Michfest, they actually distributed flyers. They tried to raise awareness about trans issues, and they also held a survey. And 72% of the respondents said that they were okay with transsexual people attending Michfest. Now, whether they thought trans men or trans women, I don't know. I don't know if the survey was that specific. But even in 1991, there are a lot of people who just were like, I don't really care. This doesn't really affect me that much. There have always been the militant vocal transphobes, the kind who marched up to Nancy in the first place, demanded to know whether she was transsexual and that kept escalating until she was kicked out. There have always been people like that, but have also always been people who accepted us, who fought for us, and a lot of people who were just really fucking bloody ignorant.
I will say, so far, Michfest with a T doesn't really quite measure up to the absolute furor or just I imagined based on how important it is made out to be on Tumblr and whatnot and how with relative frequency it is invoked. I imagined something more than just the most basic bitch story of like just rank transmisogyny, just very, very unremarkable sort of event where like basically trans people used to be fine going here just fine, but then the organizers turned out to be transphobic, and once it came over to like a boiling point, they became turbo transphobic, and then everything kind of collapsed. That's a very basic bitch kind of story that happened to a lot of social spaces over the years, and I was expecting something more, is all.
Yeah, based on how it's talked about, I was expecting like that from the very beginning it would have been some sort of everyone was doing like XX salutes with their arms crossed next to each other and chanting cervix, cervix, cervix. Ovaries, ovaries, ovaries. I don't know. Like it doesn't strike me as something that was foundationally turfy in any sense of the word. Just that like background transphobic radiation slowly
I'm
tilted
so
in that
happy you
direction.
two said this and like went on this like incredibly long aside about how it doesn't seem that foundationally transphobic, because now I get to talk about the other incident involving the Lesbian Avengers. Obviously, I can't get into their entire history or anything, but the Lesbian Avengers were a group of cis lesbians who supported trans women's inclusion at Michfest and who organized a couple of actions in order to basically challenge the woman born woman policy at Michfest and like supported the attendees of Camp Trans. There's actually a section over here where a trans man called Simon recounts the story of his first festival, which was apparently where a bunch of these actions with the Lesbian Avengers happened, and which apparently was the festival where a trans guy with phallo showered nude as well. Same one, allegedly.
Okay.
So I'll just read this part out. The ticket buying action. At noon on Saturday, Riki, that's trans activist Riki Ann Wilchins, led a ticket buying action at the fest. A bunch of the Avengers, the Lesbian Avengers are a lesbian direct action group that have prioritized fighting for the rights of trans women. So a bunch of the Avengers, myself included, bought tickets to the fest. The young trans woman who was with us, a 16-year-old girl, also bought a ticket, though at the time she could have been read as other than woman born woman. So here's the thing. The grammar in the sentence is a little bit wonky. I don't know if Simon is trying to say that the girl did or didn't pass. We'll leave that ambiguous, I'm afraid.
It sounds to me like she's saying that she didn't always pass. But it is a very awkward way of phrasing that.
Indeed. Continuing. This was a great victory for us, and there were certainly tears. Then the trouble began. A woman started walking in front of us, shouting, "Man on the land!" There's a reason I harped on it earlier. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh,
We
no.
did have some support from festi-goers who walked with us. We got to the main area, and it was very overwhelming. We were asked if we wanted to have a mediated discussion in the kitchen tent. Before that discussion, women were just coming at us from all over. Some to be supportive, some to yell at us, and some to stare. Yes, dear, I also noticed. I also noted the pun. We're moving on. There was very little middle ground, and it was very hostile. So we started this mediated discussion, and the setup was such. We, us Avengers, maybe 4 of us, and Riki, were sitting on folding tables in the front, while 7 rows of angry lesbians yelled at us audience style. I kid you not, people called us rapists, woman haters, said we were destroying their space by just walking on it, that we had no respect for women, that we had no respect for rape survivors, etc. 3 hours this lasted, and the mediation was so one-sided we didn't get out of there with any confidence that anyone heard what we had to say. That was my first festival.
Wow.
Yikes.
It feels a bit rigged because, like, I'll be real. We know that there were trans supportive people at Michigan's at Michfest. The efficacy of being trans supportive while still attending Michfest, something to debate. But we know that there were such lesbians, such people, such women there. So the fact that they got 7 rows of women shouting abuse at them, a mediated discussion. Later on, again, when we get to Lisa Wiggles' 2018 interview, she tries to play very innocent, but I was like, Lisa, cut the bullshit.
Yeah. But like, do we have any knowledge of like when was this in relation to Michfest starting? Like, or
This is
when was this
1999.
temporally?
This section that I'm talking about with the Lesbian Avengers and Simon's first festival, it's 1999. Why do you ask?
So closer to the end life of Michfest, basically.
Closer to 2015 than 1975. Yeah. Because like and like it's 1999, right? This is before the transgender tipping point. This is before like men's activism had really coalesced on a very specific message and things like that in the late 2000s. So yeah, before 2007. So yeah, before Whipping Girl, before the word transmisogyny was popularized and such.
I'm gonna go on a slight tangent, a very slight one.
All right.
So in
Mhm.
the Whipping Girl, there is this passage that has always given me trouble. There is this passage where Serrano talks about basically her walking by a bunch of men, strangers, and them, or like actually a couple, a man and a woman. I think it doesn't really matter, but they
Yeah,
make a derogatory comment about her.
a
They
man
they
and a woman.
clock her.
You're right. Yeah.
Yeah. They make a derogatory comment about her, something to the effect of like, does he think he looks like a woman, or something to that effect. It's a derogatory and demeaning for having clocked her as trans. She then posits that like, if a transmasculine individual or a butch woman were walking by them, they
Mhm.
might clock them, but they wouldn't make the same derogatory comments. And that has always struck me as a little bit like almost out of touch or something,
Mhm.
because when people see what they basically read as dyke, right? For all intents and purposes, like a woman that is too masculine, they do make
Mhm.
derogatory comments and they do make regendering comments, right? They are not usually
Yeah.
the exact same as like, in nature as transmisogynistic comments, although sometimes they are very similar. But
Mhm.
to say that like, oh, a butch or a trans man wouldn't incur the same kind of derision that I have, it just seemed a
Mhm.
little bit out of touch for me. But then like, she was in Camp Trans and
Mhm.
Whipping Girl was informed by
Uh-huh.
experiences at Camp Trans and Michfest,
Mhm.
that I can
Mhm.
kind of see the origin of like where you would
Yep.
make this comparison from.
If I were to make any critiques of Whipping Girl, I have a few. I have talked to Sarana herself about them. The way it's a bit out of touch with the oppression of, as you say, masculine women, transmasculine people, that would definitely be one of them. It is why I talked to transmasculine people and worked pretty hard on coming up with like the degendering, regendering framework in a way that like acknowledges the asymmetry in the transphobia that trans women and trans men experience without like
Mhm,
outright just misgendering trans masks and trans men in the process of talking about their oppression, basically.
mhm,
But also, yeah, like I would say that like Whipping Girl should have been cognizant of like discussing oppression in the wider context of patriarchy and not just like specifically lesbian spaces. But yeah, Serrano's been to Camp Trans. Serrano's, done this shit. And that was like there's this very interesting environment that I guess could really only have happened in the lesbian feminist context of the United States, where butches and like trans men and like quote unquote women's masculinity was more acceptable than trans women. And, at the time when it came out in 2007, trans misogyny was not something that like anyone really gave that much attention to because like the
mhm,
idea of like taking the disgust and dismissal and dehumanization of trans women seriously, not popular, you know?
mhm.
But yeah, that was the story of Simon's first Michfest as part of the Lesbian Adventures. Apparently, I do wonder if could you not have found a non-16-year-old trans girl to do that action with? Obviously, the trans girl agreed, but is it that's a very charged situation to bring a teenager into. But all right,
Yeah.
that is the other big major event regarding Mitchfest's transphobia and specifically trans misogyny that people have heard of. Sometimes they conflate it with the expulsion of Nancy Jean Burkholder. They're two separate events separated by 8 years. But it does go to show that I would feel very safe saying that I do think Mitchfest was somewhat institutionally turfy. I do think that the
Well, no,
organizers and the founder, yeah,
the whole women born women policy does give it away,
yes, yes.
like
Yep,
immediately.
yep. But yeah, hearing Simon relate this incident like this, it leaves such a bitter taste in my mouth because it was okay. They were trying to have a mediated discussion. The lesbian Avengers and trans activists came in good faith, and the response of the mediated discussion, I guess what they just picked out the most transphobic lesbians to scream abuse at them. That's fishy. That's kind of nasty.
I'm gonna like just imagine that what kind of happens in these kinds of things is that they just obviously the most transphobic people around will come to this discussion deliberately to stir shit, and all it takes is simply
Yeah.
not stopping them.
Well,
Yeah.
And that was 1999. In 2003, at the 2003 Camp Trans, there was another attempt at dialogue, presumably because no one would have been willing to do a repeat of what happened in 1999. This time it was done via zine. Two fest workers, one femme, one butch, actually came over to Camp Trans on one of the days bearing zines. The zines, they allege, are a compilation of various opinions held by the women who work the festival across the road. So this isn't attendees. This is women who work the festival. Although I will say, how hard is that distinction when presumably regulars attendees are asked to pitch in and things like that. So presumably regulars are also just become volunteers, whatever. Let's say that these are the opinions of women who are involved in a slightly more official capacity with Michfest than just baseline attendee. Okay. And they were like, okay, this is our attempt at mediation. It's our attempt at dialogue and whatnot. And Michelle T is very unimpressed because it's T says, I don't think anyone here at Camp Trans is unaware of the opinions of festival goers, are unaware of either their support or their opposition or their ignorance. These are trans people, they should know. But the zine is called a manual transmission, and the box arrived, the zines were passed out, everyone at Camp Trans gathered to read it and discuss it. And I'm going to read an excerpt from manual transmission here. The workers who brought the zines said that they had tried to make sure that there wasn't overtly transphobic material in the zine, but this excerpt was in it. And let me read it out to you. Let's be clear about what woman-born woman means. It's not about defining a goddamn thing. It is about saying, this is what I'm gathering around for this particular moment. It is saying that this festival, this period in time, is for women whose entire life experience has been as a girl and who still live loudly as a woman. Period. How is that defining you? Why do you think we are so ignorant as to not get that, to not figure out that we also have privilege for not struggling with the brain-body disconnect? But can you be so obstinate? Can you be so determined to not understand that we have an experience that is outside yours? And that experience, even though we have greater numbers, still entitles us to take separate space? Do you not see it as full-on patronizing that you act as though these thousands of women's shelters can't make up their own minds and policies? Doesn't it make you sick to have the same objectives as the religious right? Why is it okay to ignore the need of women who do not want to see a penis? How and what world do we live in that you can completely divorce these things? Like being white and telling everyone your skin color doesn't matter because you are not a racist? Stop assuming our ignorance. Dicks are not useless signifiers, even unwanted ones. You who I love and call my community of political bandits. You who grew up being seen as treated as regarded as boys, and perhaps miserably failing at that performance. You did not grow as I. You did not experience being held out as a girl and cropped into that particular box. You gotta understand you are my sister, but you don't have that experience. And taking my experience and saying it is yours, don't make it yours. It makes it stolen.
Female socialization!
Okay, well, yes, this is very
What do
female.
we think?
That's absolutely right. Also, I was just gonna point out, and then I'm gonna have Beth go off about AFAB socialization. But I will just point out that this is a music festival where the target audience is adults. They're hooking up. And you're like, you didn't go to third grade as a girl. And it's like, who cares?
Also, the whole, we don't want to see a penis. Bitch, I don't want to show you my penis.
Exactly. Who cares? Who cares whether you cut pigtails at age 3? Why does it matter when you are a 25-year-old hooking up with someone in a tent?
Yeah, I'm sorry, but gazing upon my penis is a privilege that I only grant to the most woke of dykes. Fuck off. And honestly, okay, this is a camp attendee, so she paid hundreds of dollars to attend, has very strong opinions on it, and again, based on what multiple people have reported on the racial makeup of Michfest, was very likely a white woman. I don't really understand why they play these games. For the record, okay, if you want to define membership and entry into womanhood by the degree of womanhood, by the degree of oppression and suffering you have experienced, sit down, white girl.
Anyway,
Beth,
so what did this
go.
remind you of, Beth? Because it did also remind me of it.
It's the entire female socialized talking point. The entire, we need to have a special little club for people who went through female socialization and weren't taught to be boys during their youth. Trans women, of course, famously were taught to take up space and assert themselves in a way that the AFABs simply never get to do. Socialization is this immutable trait that you get as you're growing up, and no amount of transition can change it, which is a totally reasonable way to approach fucking trans people.
It's incredibly frustrating because like this letter has like a bits of materialist transfeminism in it. Like this is someone who has tried to engage with the debate and remember some of it. She's like, you who I call my sisters, you who grew up being regarded as boys and perhaps miserably failed at performance. It's like, what the fuck you mean perhaps? Yeah, I grew up as a boy. That meant I was like beaten and molested and like third sexed and degendered and fucking marginalized when I did not, successfully give boy, which started as early as like, yeah, under 10 years old. Like, people were like, "Ah, you know what? No, fuck this. You know what? I don't have to carve my flesh open and show you my scars for you to take me seriously. Shut the fuck up, white girl."
So often the idea that trans women are women fails when people are asked to consider what the trans woman's lived experience before transitioning was like.
Yeah. And like imagine this level of like militancy and outrage and like sheer like, you have not suffered like us. You can afford to go to Michigan Women's Festival. Are you sure this is a game you want to play?
Like, there are not that many trans girls who could just drop the entry fee to go to Michfest. That's for sure.
And it's also the funniest thing, if we're talking about entry to a music festival. Why is there a blood tax?
It is symbolic. It's lesbian feminist. It was founded by working class lesbians, all that good stuff. It's still a music festival at the end of the day. I hate to say it, but like the tides of feminism have not been that much affected by whether or not Michfest Women's Festival exists. Shit was getting worse while Michfest was still going on, and shit is still bad now that Michfest women, that like Michfest, does not like annually meet anymore. Like it's cool, the idea of like a female only space where women can roam free and naked without, the fucking eye of Sauron of patriarchy gazing upon us at all times. Yeah, cool. Doesn't actually do much. Especially when there's a $350 price tag for a ticket.
Mm-hmm.
And like I would hope that's not particularly controversial to say, but like you actually do have to do more than carving out a separate space for yourself to exist within in order to actually do something that is meaningfully feminist. TBH.
Yeah, because like no matter how nice the inside of the space is, the outside of the space still exists.
Yeah. And like we can try to sequester ourselves and cloister ourselves away from that, but like, and we need that. We deserve that. I have that. My social circles are not representative of the wider population. But I'm not like under any misapprehensions that like my existence and, my existing in a particular friend group has a noticeable effect on wider patriarchy. Like, think about Mountain. Mountain was a lesbian who was in a trans femme inclusive separatist commune. And that's very cool for them. But I don't think they made a meaningful dent in the feminist movement or struck a decisive blow against patriarchy. I'm sorry to say.
Unfortunately not. I mean, these are all good things, but good for like morale and whatnot of people and for forming connections and whatnot, but it's not that deep. It's not a revolution.
Yep. So, all right, let's start to wind down. Let's head towards the end of Michelle T's article and towards a couple of other pieces I'm interested in talking about. I don't necessarily think we need to like linger on Lisa Vogel's interview that much. By the way, I think I snarkily referred to it enough times that y'all get the gist. In 2018, after Michfest closed down, Lisa Vogel gave an interview at After 11, and she was like, "Oh, I was never against trans people per se. There's a diversity of opinion, but also you'll notice that there were a very loud minority who really had it, who were really misogynistic and had it like, okay, cool. Like, I hear the dog whistles, girl. It's fine. It's 2018. The like anti-trans reactionary wave is in full swing. You could have just said what you meant out loud. You didn't have to play the games anymore. It's fine. Call us slurs into paper. They will give you a goddamn editorial position at the Times. Go nuts." After all of that, one final amusing note I would like to end on. Michelle T and like a couple of Camp Trans attendees who stayed back on the very last day after most of the Camp Trans attendees had already gone home. They decided to do this like funny thing where they just decided to sneak into Michfest for a little bit. This was very much against Camp Trans policy. Michfest had occasionally accused Camp Trans of like encouraging people to sneak in, which wasn't true. And they didn't have good evidence for it, but they would still say that. But But over here, Michelle Teal is like, oh, but like we came across some wristbands, and we were just like, look, we're just gonna take a stroll through the woods. We're not gonna do anything. And we're just like, well, okay, it's officially against Cam Trans policy. You are affiliated with Cam Trans, and if people find out about it, it's gonna look bad. And then you wrote about it. But okay, whatever, girl. Fine, you go have fun. They did that. One of the trans women went with them. It was mostly chill. Nothing particularly of note happened. But one interesting thing I'd like to highlight that Michelle also highlighted. They walked past the S&M camp. So S&M stands for sadomasochism. We know it better as BDSM these days. And that was also a topic of hot debate in lesbian feminist discourse back in the 90s. And I guess extending all the way up to 2003. And like the lesbian feminists who attended Michfest also wanted to include the S&M practitioners, who I guess were being treated as like a separate group. They would like set up a camp, and then they would do a lot of like very loud play with whips and things like that. And there were a lot of very scandalized lesbian feminists who were like, how dare you bring the patriarchy onto these sanctioned hallowed grounds? Don't you know that if you paddle a woman, even if you are a woman, you magically transform into a man when you do that?
Sure.
That's the funniest thing about like this particular strain of lesbian feminism. By the way, they'll go hard on the like, yeah, trans women can never be women, but also you transform into a man instantly if you like penetrate your partner or whatever.
Very
So
one-sided
strange.
rules.
So that is like part of the wider debate about like sexual politics and about like, the encroaching heterosexual rot within lesbian communities. But like, I'm gonna step away from like Michelle T's article for a second because I have a friend who is an academic, Aaron Elkins, who is also a colleague and an author of lesbian fiction, who sent me a letter that a colleague of hers actually dug up while doing archival work about lesbian separatism and stuff in the 90s. And there was apparently an organization, a secret society called Seps Against Sadomasochism, who tried to organize actions at Michfest. This isn't a pamphlet. It's like it's sort of like letters circulated amongst the members, and it's not dated, but it's so funny. And I'm gonna just read out a little bit of this one-page excerpt that Aaron sent me from the Seps Against Sadomasochism Plan for Michigan. We believe that our political integrity demands that we find ways to confront sadomasochists, that we must actively challenge them at this year's Michigan Festival. We want to make sadomasochists uncomfortable at Michigan. Our activism, however, cannot take any form that derives from or is suggestive of the heteropatriarchal conceptual framework in which their sexuality is grounded. We are, therefore, engaged in devising numerous actions that don't fit the dichotomies inherent in their framework. Among the dichotomies essential to sadomasochism are master-slave. I'm not going to read that one out. Man/woman, top/bottom, teacher/student, parent/child, mobile/immobile, and so on. Many of their scenes are based on sensory dichotomies such as hot-cold, soft-hard, weak-strong, and more generally, pain-pleasure. Essential to their conceptual framework is the definition of pain and as pleasure. We're thinking of specific methods of disrupting their activities at Michigan that are outside of the power over dichotomies that give them pleasure. In addition, our ideas must avoid the conceptual trap of assuming that action equals violence. For example, if we were to toss firecrackers into the midst of one of their orgies, we would be feeding the warped sexuality they embrace. Don't firebomb the sadomasochists. They're into that shit.
So fucking funny. I'm sorry.
I don't think this was a notable group because, this is the first time hearing of them and such. I don't think they ever got the stones to not firebomb a Michfest lesbian sadomasochistic orgy. But this has always been part of the debate, a certain obsession with purity politics that we talked about in the other episode. And there have always been dykes who I'll put it the way Aaron put it. There were a lot of ex-Catholics in this quote unquote radfem space, and genuinely, if women could be ordained by the Catholic Church, we wouldn't have had to deal with half of them.
The funniest thing is okay, I was rolling my eyes before it even came to that, just because the nature of the protest is so please just go outside. Surely there are more important things to loudly protest in the street. When it came to the first thing in the pamphlet is what we are not going to do to protest. And it's at the least, this strikes me as inefficient.
Yeah.
Yep. I also like how they tied themselves in knots about the whole if we do violence then we're acting within the male female dichotomy that you think You think that in a society where like everything is gendered, gendering everything is bad, these people twisted themselves in knots, being like, how do we act in a way that isn't gendered? And it's like, you can't in a society that genders everything. You have to actually confront the fact that that happens and work against it.
Ladies, is it male to be assertive? I don't know.
Oh my god, that's literally it though. It's male to be assertive, it's male to be angry, it's male to speak up for yourself. And it's just like, okay, well, you've just thrown feminist organizing down the trash then, haven't you? Like, is this about like you proving that you are the most female in existence, or is this about helping women?
Obviously the former.
Organizing is too rigid and masculine. Can't we just go by our intrinsic feminine wisdom and intuition?
Yeah, why don't we live the most pure lesbian feminist lives we can? And if everyone just did that, patriarchy would vanish. Like, oh my god. Like, I can't even get through the sarcasm. This is so unserious. This is so unserious. This is the militancy. This is the militancy of middle class academics who want to rationalize their discomfort with people who are like, freakier or like more transsexual or just like, just more marginalized than they are in a lot of cases. And it's so ineffective and it's so ineffectual, and like this kind of bullshit being at the core of the like debates around Michigan's admission policy is like genuinely, I think, set us back. It genuinely was such a fucking sideshow. We could have been building an effective feminism, but instead you had to argue about whether or not the sadomasochists would be into it if you firebombed them. Can you just get a life? Can you get a hobby? Can you get serious, please?
Well, looking at the current state of politics, we can clearly tell that the answer to that question is no.
No. Oh my god. Well, yeah, sorry. There's gonna be another Crack Dive episode where we end on a pretty depressing note. Sorry about that. Feminism was fucked in the 90s and it's also fucked today. Subscribe for more.
Pretty much.
So this brings us to the last thing that I wanted to discuss. Let's finish off with two excerpts from the memoir of Minnie Bruce Pratt. Minnie Bruce Pratt is Leslie Feinberg's partner, and a towering lesbian feminist intellectual in her own right. I wish her books and her work was more well known as much as Feinberg's is. There are two excerpts about Michfest in her memoir, S/he. So it's like a she with a slash between the S and the H. That I would like to just read out loud one after the other, okay? The first excerpt. At the campsite outside Women's Land, a lesbian femme talks to me about her decision to come to the music festival. She was reluctant after she heard a transsexual lesbian had been thrown out the previous year, accused of being a man. That's Nancy Jean Burkholder. Still, this was a vacation they could afford just barely. So she told her butch, who didn't look like someone who could pass the woman-born woman-only policy, that she would drive them in. Maybe the women at the gate would be less likely to notice them because as a femme, she looked the way people expected women to look. The rumor was that the transsexual woman could have stayed last year if she'd been willing to strip. The femme didn't want her butch to have to go through that. This is an interesting twist because Nancy Jean Burkholder in her testimony in Michelle T's article said that she offered to drop her drawers, but they just wanted to kick her out. Like, the presence or absence of an actual penis was not the problem. She was transsexual, she was tainted. And the next excerpt, the second and final bit of text I want to read out for this episode, also from Minnie Bruce Pratt's memoir. The last and only time I'd been at the festival, I'd walked uneasily around the temporary town of 6,000 or so women, on paths that wound between tents, performance stages, and masses of ferns. This women's land, this refuge, felt unreal and dangerous to me. Finally, after walking by thousands and thousands of white women, I realized I have never lived, even briefly, in a place that had so few people of color. The only space I'd occupied for any length of time that was more segregated was the whites-only schoolroom of my childhood.
Wow.
And I think that's the best note
Interesting.
Called
to end
it.
this episode on. The cis stacks weren't down with their bullshit either. Just saying.
Called it. I knew it. I knew it was going to be white as shit.
What was your first clue?
I mean, there were so many clues coming in so quickly. It was hard not to call it.
$300 ticket, I think, was a pretty big one. This is like not. This is not to say that like women of color are like incapable of separatist politics or are incapable of transphobia, or that like there are no women of color who would enjoy or benefit from a space away from men, or there are no women of color who want that. But there is a certain tendency that is real in feminist politics of the most outspoken to be the most privileged, and to think that they have their finger on the pulse, but just have these massive oversights that they just can't quite account for. And this happens over and over again along racial lines, especially in Western feminism, which kind of sucks because like Western feminism is what sets the tone and the discourse for feminism worldwide, whether we like it or not.
I mean, I will also say that and this isn't to take away from that conversation, but it's also along the class lines, because class lines and race lines in Western society cannot be divided, because after all, part of the point of race and, ethnic discrimination is to designate certain kinds of people for labor exploitation.
Yeah.
Among other things. So those things are not extricable from each other.
Yeah, and like it kind of sucks. It kind of sucks how like in the modern day we have this entire chorus about like feminism being imperialist and white and exclusionary and colonial and all that jazz. And it like, I've talked a lot about why I find that chorus mostly only succeeds in silencing the feminism and the testimony of colonized, racialized women the world over. But sadly, there is a fucking grain of truth to it. There are embarrassments like Lisa Vogel and the Michfest attendees who, well, I wouldn't say give teeth, but like give some substantiation to that idea. And it's deeply, deeply depressing for me as a brown trans woman of color to have to contend with today.
Yeah.
And that's the story of Michfest, largely as told by Michelle T.
What have we learned?
Well, we haven't learned anything we didn't already know, to be honest.
Nope. I'm just kind of sad, and I do kind of wish we could just move past it at this point. Like, it is a thing that happened. It was billed as this like ultimate triumph of lesbian feminism, but like at the end of the day, it was just a bunch of white women playing pretend.
I think the lesson here is that we will always be haunted by the misdeeds of American white women we'll never meet.
Yeah, and I will also say that Michfest is often brought up as like basically a sin from which we have moved on, but like that some people need to pay forward or whatever. We didn't move on from this kind of bullshit, I'm sorry to say.
No.
Yeah, because like the reason we shouldn't talk about Michfest is because Michfest was not like the cause or the problem. Michfest was one of the things that like implemented a very pervasive mindset regarding trans women's place in feminism, lesbianism, and women-only spaces, whatever you want. Like Michfest is the most sort of like visible example of that debate, of that pitched fight between enlightened feminists at that, of whether or not trans women belong. You know what? They fucked up. They had 40 years to get it right. And Lisa Vogel was right. I'd rather end Michfest than let the trannies in. And I'm sure part of that was motivated by the fact that, like, the boycotts and the controversy just, like, left Michfest largely insolvent. And, she started at 19. She was going on 60, I think, when she ended Michfest. And she was just like, I don't have time for this anymore. But she still held that goddamn transphobic line for 40 years of her goddamn life. And the thing I would like the most is if we just left that mindset in the dust where it belongs. Because, like, as much distaste I have for this kind of politics and of Lisa Vogel and all that, in 2025, this isn't quite our biggest problem. It's a symptom of it. It's quite related to it, but it's all around the core question of, can we give trans women legitimacy as women? Which is a question that apparently reactionaries and patriarchs are incredibly, incredibly terrified of answering in the affirmative.
And for as long as nobody wants to just say yes, we'll keep reinventing the same bullshit from vibes.
From first principles, even.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first principles in this situation are vibes, so...
Well, this has been your evil lesbian feminists.
Reminiscing on the sins of our past.
Yep.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.
Cracked Ivory is supported by Patreon. Join us at patreon.com/crackedivorypod to receive early access to our episodes, as well as full Patreon exclusive episodes and behind-the-scenes content. Follow Talia Bad at taliabad.com and Emma Zaharuk at dolphindiaries.card.co for their solo feminist projects. Cracked Ivory is edited by Emma Zaharuk and produced by Talia Bad and Emma Zaharuk. All music is by Kevin MacLeod. Special thanks to White Mirror, Lava Monster, Axon.dev, Ceiling Fan, Yana Dunfield, Candy Barber, and Nix Taylor. Thanks for listening.